Retirement is like descending a mountain. You need a careful, considered approach. Join us in today's episode as we discuss different strategies to make sure that you reach base camp safely. Hi, this is Andrew Busa, Manager of Financial Planning at Advisor Investments, and we're here with another Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. And today I'm joined by my colleague Diana Linn, Account Executive and Financial Planner.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's good to be able to do another episode together. This will be a good one. So as we kind of looked back on all the podcasts that we've done, and I know you and I have been part of some of these, we've done many episodes sort of on the accumulation side of wealth planning and financial planning, right? How to prioritize your savings, taking advantage of different tax techniques, things like that. But what about once you've reached the mountaintop, right? You're done accumulating, you're done saving. Now you're at the top of the mountain. Now it's time to get down the mountain safely. So in today's episode, we're going to approach a couple of different things. First, we'll sort of broach that larger question of how to approach that kind of do you have enough to retire idea before we talk about some of these common withdrawal strategies or rules of thumb that often pop up in finance. You know, you kind of see them around on the internet if you do some searching. And then we'll discuss how it makes sense for you to actually approach it. So just to kind of set the table a little bit more, you know, some of these strategies you see the 4% rule, right? We'll talk about that.
Sure.
And we'll talk about a simpler version of the 4% rule as well. I'm also talking about something called the bucket strategy. We'll talk about Monte Carlos, all this good stuff.
Ooh, lots of exciting stuff. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And so any other thoughts before we dive into the meat?
No, I mean, I really like this topic. So, so much of the planning that we do, both personally and with our clients, is really surrounding that accumulation phase of life. So, getting to the top of the mountain. And then once you get there, it really is like, do you have enough money to stop working?
Right.
Are you prepared for retirement? And then now that you've arrived, you're at the top, you've reached retirement. What do you want that next phase of your life to look like, right? Do you need a larger travel budget? Are you going to purchase a second home? All of those types of things. And then, most importantly, how are we going to pay for it? So I'm glad we're talking about this today.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you think about it, all of these guidelines and rules of thumb, they exist for one purpose, and it's to try to figure out if you have enough money to stop working, right? I mean, that's why most of us are here, you know, in this business to try to help folks understand if they can retire. But I think it's important to kind of put some parameters around, you know, why these rules of thumb could be useful and when they might not be so useful, and when they might be a little overly simplistic. You know, the way we
Right.
do planning, right? We're kind of using someone's financial plan as a way to determine their optimal withdrawal strategy, I think.
Yeah, when we're creating a financial plan, we're trying to, determine have you accumulated enough assets to use your bucket that you just mentioned, Andrew,
Hmm.
like to stop saving and filling up that bucket because once you're in retirement, you're now kind of switching on that spigot and starting to
Hmm.
drain out, those assets that you've been saving over time. So a lot needs to go into that, a lot of ingredients into understanding, especially expenses. So in retirement, do you think that your expenses are going to remain about the same? Maybe they're going to increase that you've got more free time on your hands, going to be traveling a little bit more, maybe gifting to the grandkids, or maybe things are going to slow down a little bit. We've also got to remember to factor in inflation. I think that's something that can get overlooked. So I know when we're building our financial plans, we like to use that 2.5% of the
Hmm.
inflation.
And for healthcare too, right? I
Yep.
mean, you talk about inflation. That's another um, area that we inflate aggressively is healthcare costs. And that's unfortunately been the historical trend with that category of spending. Medical and healthcare expenses tend to rise faster than, you know, the price of eggs, as it were.
Right. Right. Yeah. And then another one of those major ingredients, of course, is income sources. So once you've kind of mapped out, okay, I think my budget in retirement, I'm going to be spending X number of dollars every month or each year. And I know that I'm going to get this much in from Social Security. Perhaps you have a pension, investment income, rental income. You can kind of back into what that gap amount is, right? So X number of expenses, Y being my income to sort of know what kind of drip you need to turn on from that spigot, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. So you think about creating a financial plan for somebody. Those are really the ingredients that we need to gather. We need to know
Hmm.
those expenses. We need to know income sources. Of course, we need to know, what assets are available for you to spend. And that starts to put together a rough picture of how much somebody will be needing to withdraw from their portfolio
Right.
every year in retirement. So it's not like, we're using a rule of thumb such as the 4% rule and saying, okay, how do we apply this rule to this person's financial plan? It really works the other way around. Kind of the more that I've thought about it, I feel like we're customizing the withdrawal strategy to the plan, if that makes sense.
No, I think you're exactly right. And, that 4% rule that you just mentioned, that I think is one of the most common
Hmm.
methodologies out there, of how to think about what you're going to need in retirement, that 4%. But you just want to keep in mind that that 4%, you've got to escalate it over time with the inflation. And I think that up until this year, maybe inflation hasn't really been talked about or thought about as often as it should.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but now, in the last year, we've all seen the
Oh,
price of,
yeah.
of many goods rise very quickly. So, well, would be remiss. We've mentioned the 4% rule a few times here, but let's actually open that up a little bit and start talking about, these different guidelines, and starting with that 4% rule, because I think that's probably the most commonly known one, I would say. I see it around on the internet a lot, or talked about on the news every now and then. And recently it has been sort of debated, the viability of it. So let's start by discussing kind of the history of this rule, and kind of the background of it.
Ooh, I feel like I'm being quizzed here,
You
but
are, yeah.
I think this idea, it was first introduced in a Journal of Financial Planning article published in 1994. And
Hmm.
I'm not going to tell you how old I was in 1994, but I was absolutely old enough to have read this
Yep.
article. But the 4% rule, it was really intended to make your sure that your retirement savings could last for 30 years or more. So,
Hmm.
traditionally people enter in retirement in your 60s, and making sure you have enough to last a really nice, time horizon. So when somebody retired, if they had a portfolio comprised of about 60% equities, 40% bonds, and that if you withdrew 4%, and continue to adjust that for inflation each year. So not, Andrew, necessarily 4% of the total balance each year, but
Hmm.
that initial 4%, that would create a steady income stream to last you throughout those 30 years of retirement. So that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of that rule of thumb.
Got it. So it's been around since 1994, so but
Yep.
definitely been around a while. I mean, what do you think is the appeal to this approach? Why do you feel like it took off from a from a magazine that not a lot of people read, to be
I mean,
to
I
be
read,
honest, right? We
but
read it, but a lot of people don't. Why is it so widely known today, do you think?
yeah, I think a huge portion of that success is the simplicity,
Hmm.
with it, of that, that's real easy to remember. 4%, and I'm going to generate this consistent stream of income. But as we know, Andrew, from building so many financial plans for people, that managing retirement is really a balancing act for that
Hmm.
saving. So even if you're using this rule of thumb of that 4%, if you withdraw too fast and maybe one year, oh, I'm just going to go a little bit above that 4% this year, you could potentially run out of money. And then on the flip side, if you are, if that number is too conservative, then you may have spent all this time in accumulation saving this nest
Hmm.
egg, so to speak, and then not turning on enough of that spigot to drain the bucket. So you're kind of walking that fine line there of that balancing act.
Right. So the simplicity is kind of both the strength and a
Hmm.
weakness of
Sure.
this. I mean, the founder, really, to dive into the article, little bit more in his methodology. He came up with that 4% figure by looking at historical market returns and inflation data going all the way back to 1926. So then essentially kind of looking forward from there, looking at, okay, if someone retired basically every year thereafter, how long would the hypothetical retirees
Mhm.
nest egg sort of last, from retirement to, however long, given every possible sort of market condition, right? So he kind of landed on this 4% as, all right, no matter what happens in the market, you'll always be okay if you kind of stick with this 4%
Yeah.
rule. But having said that, this 4% rule has been debated recently, especially in the last couple of years. What's your take on that?
And I think we're seeing this debate really happen on both sides. So some
Hmm.
people on one side of the coin saying that, oh my goodness, that 4% is way too generous, or that 4% is a little bit too conservative. I know Michael Kitsis, one of the other financial planners that we follow a lot of his content, he thinks that that 4% rule is a little too conservative. And so
Mm.
I think this is a wonderful sort of back of the napkin rule of thumb to kind of double check your
Hmm.
financial and retirement readiness, but isn't necessarily the only thing that you should rely on.
I really like that way of looking at it. It's a back of the napkin approach. I think that's
Yeah.
perfect. This is not the end all be all of, you check this box and you're sort of you're good to retire. I think it's a fun kind of exercise to go through and kind of mental framework, but I'm not sure it really should be used beyond that. I think if you can ideally work with a financial planner to create your own financial plan, and we'll talk about this as we go on, but I think that's a really good way to put it. And then there's another sort of version of the 4% rule that's even simpler.
Tell us about it.
Well, this is the constant percentage strategy. Really, the only difference here is that inflation doesn't really come into play, right? So instead of adjusting that withdrawal, like you said, for inflation every year, this is just no, we're sticking with a flat percentage every year, and you never really do any math beyond that. That's what you take out of your
Mhm.
portfolio every year, and you sort of and you move on.
I mean, I know we were speaking about this earlier this morning on an unrelated subject, but I'm wondering how many people really are factoring in inflation into
Right.
that when they're doing that back of the napkin
Yeah.
4%, rule. So I'm wondering if almost this simplistic younger sibling, as you say, has
Hmm.
kind of become the predominant strain, like the predominant
Yeah.
way of thinking of just that 4% without factoring in inflation. I don't know.
That's kind of interesting. Yeah. I mean, you kind of wonder how uh, these rules of thumb in theory actually get used in practice.
Hmm.
I think you probably are right that inflation sometimes isn't really taken into account, especially like you said, up until recently, inflation. Who was talking about it? Quite
Well,
frankly,
we were,
until yeah, we
and
were.
reading the financial
That's
planning
that's true.
articles.
Yes, yeah, that's true. All right, so far, we've talked about the 4% rule. We've talked about the constant percentage rule. I want to also talk about another strategy that I think has some popularity, and that's the bucket strategy.
I really like this bucket strategy. I know I use it a lot personally and with clients. And so, as I kind of even alluded to at the beginning of us speaking here, with the bucket theory, you're really thinking about the different pools of money, like different spots and types of money. So
Hmm.
I kind of think of it as I've got these buckets of money and they're not all kind of spaced apart equally. So
Hmm.
the bucket that I have closest to me is going to be my cash. And so that, my savings account, my checking account. And so that bucket of money is also going to be also my safest asset. So that's my readily available in case I have an emergency and I need it tomorrow. And then
Right.
seated a little bit further away from me in another type of bucket, I've got my joint brokerage account. So again, it is taxable money that is readily available if I need it, but a little bit further away. So that I can take on a little bit more risk because I've got a slightly greater time horizon. The next bucket, I've got my retirement assets. And then even further out from that, being my bucket of like my Roth IRA. So that money, since it
Mhm.
has such a long time horizon, could also be my riskier assets.
Yeah, so this strategy I think feels very natural from what you're saying, from almost like a mental accounting standpoint, right? Where you've got this short, medium, long term money that you can sort of assign different goals to and purposes for.
Having this bucket strategy can also create a little bit of a more of a sense of calm. So, it's
Mhm.
no secret that this past, month in the market has had quite a bit of volatility. So, if you
Right.
know that I've got these different bucket strategies and each bucket is serving a different purpose and I'm turning the spigot on, of that bucket at different times. So, like you said, knowing that I've got that safe bucket of all of my cash and my other assets, that I've got enough emergency savings, I think can also help
Right.
calm, when there is that volatility.
So, what is, if there is one, what is the downside you think of this sort of a strategy?
Yeah, and I know that I'm kind of biased because I am such a big proponent of this bucket strategy. I like the idea behind it, but I
Mhm.
think the biggest downfall is just that it's not necessarily telling you which assets to kind of tap into first, unless you're
Mhm.
also thinking of it in terms of the risk of each of those
Mhm.
buckets. So if that is a downside, I guess that could be a downside.
Right. It might be harder to sort of manage on your own.
Yeah,
I
right.
guess, right, because you get to be moving some money around between the different buckets and things like that. Probably best done with the help of a financial planner or advisor, right?
Mhm.
So I hear you there. So that's a good overview of the bucket strategy. I want to talk about another strategy that's actually similar to what we use in the plans that we create, and that's sort of this idea of the probability of failure, or using Monte Carlo simulations. Basically, all this is going to do is determine kind of the risk of running out of money given various different withdrawal rates, or
Right.
really spending levels. And so I think the appeal of this when we run financial plans for folks is they can stress test their plan, right? They can see, all right, I'm not going to run out of money most likely if I'm spending, you know, $8,000 a month. What happens if I spend $10,000 a month? What does that look like? So that is also kind of an overly simplistic way of how we do it, but I think the Monte Carlo simulation is a nice way to sort of stress test your plan.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just to back up. So the Monte Carlo, I'm sure most
Yeah.
listeners already know, but the Monte Carlo, so what we're doing there is we're taking a client's portfolio investable assets and applying it to 1,000 different market conditions. So to your point, Andrew, just to show, okay, how well do your assets and your portfolio hold up regardless of the market conditions? And so I think
Hmm.
that is providing a lot of peace of mind for a lot of individuals to see, okay, even if I have terrible market returns, after terrible market returns, that I am well set up to kind of just ebb and flow, with, the turns in the market.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great explanation of it. Well, you know what? Let's tie this all together. And I was thinking as you were talking to, and I just sort of remembered. I think in a lot of these conversations we have with folks who are getting ready to retire, the there's another question I think that comes along, and it's not only do I have enough to retire, but it's also where is this money going to come from,
Hmm.
right? And so I think that that's another sort of maybe shortfall of just using a rule of thumb to create a withdrawal strategy. If that makes
Right.
sense, I think to really understand, okay, how am I going to turn this portfolio that I've built up into a paycheck? I think that's sort of a conversation that you need to have with your advisor.
Right. Well, just like your own personal investment strategy
Right.
based on your risk and things like that, like there really is no one size fits all. So this is just that, a good rule of thumb, but from our experience, you really need that customized, unique for you situation on what your goals are, and something that is able to pivot and evolve as your goals evolve. 30-year retirement is a long time horizon.
It
So
is.
a lot can happen.
Absolutely. And our goal is to help you achieve, peace of mind throughout retirement.
Mhm.
So, we'll work with you to find a strategy that best suits you and your portfolio. And I think, I guess this is my final thought, and then I'll kick it over to you too. I think plan monitoring is so key too. That's another, you know, point to touch on with these withdrawal strategies is that it never should be a one and done idea when you're sort of creating your strategy to go into retirement. It should be reviewed, annually, every couple of years, or when circumstances change, to just make sure that you're still on track.
Absolutely. And not to bring in bad news again, but I think that that's also important. I always say that that's one of our main jobs as a financial planner is that we're trying to poke holes in someone's
Right.
plan and, almost trying to make it fail. And that's just to find those areas where we can strengthen it. So
Absolutely.
again, I think just kind of erring on that side of being overly conservative when you're making these assumptions and looking at your own withdrawal rate in retirement of just kind of tacking on a little more expenses. Like if you think it's 50,000 a year, plan it out for
Hmm.
60 and
Hmm.
and vice versa just to factor in all those unknowns because if the past 2 years have taught us anything it's that emergencies and pandemics and all sorts of things can happen and so just to really be sure you're prepared.
Yeah, we do not like to paint overly rosy pictures.
Yeah.
That's for sure, and I think that's something we've tried to take with us in all the plans that we build. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I know it's been on the minds of many people and many listeners. We've gotten questions about this, so I'm glad we took the time to sit down and do this episode. Uh, this has been Andrew Busa and Diana Linn from Advisor Investments, thanking you for listening to the Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe and review our show. You can also check us out at www.advisorinvestments.com/podcasts. Your feedback is always welcome, and if you have any questions or topics that you'd like us to explore, please feel free to email us at info@advisorinvestments.com. Thanks for listening.